Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something that feels like, well, a bedrock principle of modern democracy, transparency in government.
Mhm.
We're always told that the more we see, the more cameras, the more access we have to what our legislators are doing, the better off we are. It's supposed to improve accountability.
And that instinct is completely valid.
Yeah.
But the stack of research we've pulled together for you today suggests we might have stumbled into a bit of a paradox. The sources actually give it a name, the transparency trap.
Okay, the transparency trap. Let's unpack that. The core idea, the tension here, seems to be that this constant high-def visibility might be, I don't know, changing the game inside government?
It's shifting the incentives.
Right. And making the really complex, necessary work of governing harder. Or maybe just hiding it in plain sight.
Exactly. We're diving into this idea that for a modern politician, being seen has become hopelessly tangled up with doing the job. So our mission here is to really analyze the system-wide side effects of that change.
To see how a good intention transparency can create this unintended trap.
Where the appearance of work gets mistaken for the real thing.
Okay, so to really get that, we need a baseline. What did it look like before the cameras, before the instant clips? What was the view from the past?
Well, it's fascinating because the environment was just profoundly different. For most of Parliament's history, what happened in the main chamber was, fleeting. It was ephemeral.
You had to be there.
You had to be in the room to get the mood, the atmosphere. If you weren't, you had to rely completely on secondary sources.
So things like official records, newspaper reports.
Precisely. You had a Hansard, which preserved the words that were spoken, but it couldn't capture the moment itself. Not the tension, the dynamics, the political gravity of that specific day.
And that distance, that time lag, must have had a huge effect on how the work was judged.
A critical structural effect. It meant that, parliamentary work was judged, well, it's judged almost entirely after the fact.
By its outcomes.
By its outcomes, exactly. An MP's effectiveness wasn't based on a viral clip from a Tuesday debate. It was based on whether the law they worked on held up, whether the policy they pushed for actually delivered results years later.
So it was measured by lasting impact, not immediate performance.
Which puts a huge premium on patience and long-term thinking, kind of the opposite of our current media environment.
Absolutely.
And look, when the push for transparency came, it was driven by a good democratic impulse. The intention wasn't sinister. It was about opening the doors, about removing that feeling that the work was hidden or clubby or inaccessible.
Which it often was.
It often was. People felt shut out, and they understandably demanded to see how power was being used in their name.
So the goal was accountability. Let us see the deliberation, not just read the final dry text of the law.
That was the whole idea. But, and this is the point the analysis makes so strongly, the act of making something visible is never a neutral intervention. Systems immediately start to respond to what's being lit up.
Okay, and that brings us to the core mechanical shift. This is where we move from the history to the sort of sociology of it. The moment everything is visible, the source material says visibility itself starts to act like feedback. That feels like the pivot point for this entire deep dive.
It is. Because once people know they're constantly being seen doing their work, a really subtle but powerful human question emerges for every single person in that system.
Which is...
What does doing the job well look like on camera?
And that one question changes everything. Because in any high-stakes environment, people respond to what gets noticed, what gets rewarded.
And the researchers are really careful to stress this point. This isn't about, bad faith or opportunists suddenly flooding the system. It's just a structural response to where attention flows.
The media landscape, by its nature, doesn't spread that attention out evenly.
Not at all. A dull, necessary committee hearing just doesn't generate clicks. But a fiery 10-second confrontation, that gets shared everywhere.
So the system rewards the click economy and politicians.
They adapt. They adapt to produce the content that feeds it. It's a completely rational response. Think about the incentive structure.
Go on.
Well, if a snippet of a sharp speech is immediately clipped and shared and drives the public conversation for the day, then that kind of confrontation becomes a really valuable, rewarded activity. It proves you're present. It proves you're passionate.
But the actual critical work of legislating might the complete opposite of that. It might be sitting quietly, reading dense reports, building consensus.
Precisely. And the visual paradox is so stark. If you're sitting there quietly, reading a 400-page briefing document that looks identical on television to sitting there quietly scrolling on your phone.
The camera can't tell the difference.
It can't distinguish deep concentration from total idleness. So if silence starts to look like absence, then that essential quiet work starts to look like non-work.
And the attention naturally flows toward the visible, the dramatic. And that systematically pulls focus away from the stuff that's crucial, but, just inherently hard to see.
Which leads us right to the heart of the trap.
Mm.
All the essential work for good governance that is completely visually inert.
So what are we talking about here? Give us a picture of this unseen, intangible work.
Okay, so the list is long, but it's really crucial. First, you've got the deep, solitary work. Reading those huge briefing papers, analyzing data, talking to experts to really understand the downstream effects of a policy.
The homework, basically.
The homework. Second, there's the scrutiny work. This happens in committees where you're challenging the underlying assumptions of a bill. Committees are where the real granular work happens, where flawed bills get quietly fixed. They're often less televised, way less dramatic, but so consequential.
And what about the negotiation part?
That's the third major piece, building cross-party agreement behind the scenes. And this requires compromise, negotiation, sometimes walking back something you said publicly, and it almost always requires discretion.
Because the moment it's public, the deal can just fall apart.
The deal falls apart. So this essential stabilizing work has to stay mostly invisible. It's the complete antithesis of a shareable clip.
Okay, but hang on. Isn't that exactly what makes people suspicious? If we can't see the deals being made, how can we trust the outcome? Maybe that visibility is a necessary evil to make sure we see the principles at stake.
That's a really important question, and it's where the tension really lies. The research isn't arguing for a return to secrecy. It's arguing for a clear definition of what we value.
Meaning?
Meaning, if the reward structure only incentivizes visible performance, then legislators will inevitably focus on that performance, even if it comes at the cost of the hidden, complex negotiation you need for stable, long-lasting policy.
Okay.
You prioritize winning the point over making the law better.
This sounds so much like a problem from organizational management. The sources make that parallel, right, to the transparency trap in business.
They connect it perfectly. Think about a tech company. When the work is hard to measure, like a developer debugging a really tricky piece of old code, the value is hidden. It's critical, but you can't see it.
Right. The output is, the system didn't break this week.
Precisely. Now compare that to a salesperson who held 3 noisy, high-profile client meetings. A manager who's under pressure might just fall back on judging presence and noise. They look at who seems busy.
It's a proxy for contribution.
It's a proxy when the real value is hard to quantify. And the analysis argues that Parliament has quietly defaulted to that exact same position. Presence starts standing in for contribution. The easy-to-spot actions become stand-ins for actual impact.
And that's dangerous.
It's very dangerous because the visibility and the values start to blur in the public's mind, and you get these proxies. Speaking becomes easier to track than thinking. Attendance becomes a stronger signal than actual impact. And noise, the loud, dramatic moment, becomes easier to reward than restraint.
And the system doesn't even need to send out a memo explaining this. The signals just do the work quietly.
They do. If a representative isn't constantly seen, it becomes incredibly hard for them to explain the depth of their work.
Right.
But if someone is constantly visible, constantly vocal, it becomes dangerously easy for the public, and even their own party, to just assume they're being effective.
It simplifies everything down to one metric, media visibility.
Which can lead to real legislative flaws. The ultimate cost of skipping all that invisible work is simply bad laws. Unforeseen loopholes, laws getting struck down by courts years later because of one tiny clause that was overlooked in the rush to get a headline.
So the price of prioritizing the visible is paying for future mistakes.
Exactly.
Okay, so if that's the internal dynamic, let's pivot to how external pressures, specifically the media, make all of this worse on a timeline. It's not just that visibility is amplified. The research says media compresses time.
Absolutely. Just think about the speed of response now. A debate happens, and within hours, the clip, the narrative, the hot takes, they've all hardened before the day is even out.
Which creates these incredibly short feedback loops.
Tiny feedback loops. The system rewards what lands now or plays well now.
And if the rewards are instant, then medium and long-term thinking becomes harder and harder to justify inside the system.
Of course. Why would you invest your political capital in a delayed reward when the immediate cost of not being visible today is so high? Planning 5 or 10 years ahead doesn't get you a headline tonight. Preventing a future crisis doesn't trend.
The focus just naturally drifts away from preventing future problems and toward managing today's public reaction.
It does, but it's important to note, and the analysis really emphasizes this, Parliament is not unique here. This pattern shows up everywhere.
It's a feature of the information age meeting any large organization.
You see it in companies debating remote work. Is visible presence in the office more valuable than invisible productivity at home? You see it in healthcare, with activity targets that can crowd out good patient care. You see it in education, with measurable outputs replacing deeper, harder-to-quantify learning.
So the common thread is, whenever the definition of good work gets fuzzy, the system latches on to whatever it can easily see and measure.
Exactly. The difference, of course, is that with a legislature, the decisions echo far beyond the walls of the building. The consequences of this drift are national, and they impact every single citizen.
And inside, this must create a massive mismatch for the elected officials. They all adapt differently. Some lean into the performance, others just focus on their local issues or committee work.
Yes, but the system, officially, pretends they're all being judged by the same standard of contribution. And that gap between what gets rewarded and what actually makes for good governance, that's where the deep frustration grows.
For everyone.
For everyone. The public feels the system isn't working, and many people inside feel their most important work is completely invisible, or maybe even punished. When incentives are misaligned with the mission, performance just drifts.
Before we wrap up, we have to make sure we hit this disclaimer from the research because it's critical. This analysis is not some nostalgic argument for turning off the cameras.
No, absolutely not. It's not a call to go back to some hidden, clubby past. The analysis is definitive on this. Transparency still matters. Immensely.
For accountability for preventing corruption.
It's a necessary public check on power. But the core finding stands. And it's this. Visibility is not the same thing as work. And presence is not the same thing as contribution. We just cannot assume they're interchangeable.
And the whole drift happens when those concepts get confused. It leads to a system that struggles to value its own most vital functions.
So if we tie this all together, we've basically established that constant scrutiny, while it was intended for good, has created a structural trap. A trap where proxies, things like noise and presence, they substitute for genuine contribution.
And the sources leave us with this really heavy fundamental question that's still just hanging in the air. If visibility has become the de facto proxy for work, and the rewards are all flowing to highly visible actions,
then the institution itself has this profound need to look inward and ask a very basic question. How does Parliament decide what it actually expects from the people inside it?
what does doing the job well really mean?
Exactly. Without real clarity on that, separate from the demands of the camera, that frustration we see, both inside the building and out in the public square, it's just going to continue. It's a system struggling to define its own value in an age of inescapable scrutiny.